I, like so many others, have been watching and reading the news of what is happening right now in Europe, in Eastern Europe, the news in Ukraine from the past couple of weeks. And as I read it, as I hear about it, as I witness it, I've experienced a variety of emotions. Perhaps naively, there have been times that I held hope that diplomacy might work, that Russian troops might not actually enter the Ukrainian country. That after the last 2 years of battling a pandemic that recognized no borders, the world might stand a bit more united than it once did. I've had moments where I've experienced dread, in which it seemed that war would be inevitable, in fear of what such a conflict might escalate to. Most naively, perhaps, I still feel a sense of shock that war in Europe can happen still, that it will happen. Since the invasion of Russian forces into the country began a few days ago, those emotions have only intensified. Shock, hope, dread, fear, and a host of others, as I've read reports of Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities, as I've viewed pictures and videos of civilians fleeing their country, of families being split as some stay behind to fight. And hearing stories from the Jewish community of Ukraine, it's been equally upsetting. The Jewish history of Ukraine goes back nearly 1,000 years. At times, it's a story of a vibrant community. At one point, the population was nearly a third of the country. At times, it's a story that we as Jews know too well, a painful story, one of tragedy, a violent story, a story of pogroms and riots, bloodshed and loss in numbers that should feel unfathomable. Recently, there's a new dimension, because my emotions that I feel are not just for me in the present day, but my perspective has shifted, thinking of what is the world that I'm leaving behind someday for my daughter or my grandchildren, for generations to come. I imagine many of you have felt mixed emotions. To be honest, I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to say today. I'm not an expert on Russia. I'm not an expert on the Ukraine or its history. I'm not an expert on international politics or geopolitical conflict. And I have no knowledge of what's going on right now more than anyone else that you might be reading or listening to. And actually, I recognize that many of you who are listening to me today might know a lot more about it than I do. Many of you might be able to trace your family tree back to that region. Some perhaps have even grown up there. Some who have family and friends who are still there. So I wasn't sure what to say. We know war is bad. We know Judaism condones violence only in self-defense, and that Russia's excuses for this invasion don't fall near the criteria of what our tradition demands. But that wasn't really a message. So as I read more about Ukraine and the Jewish community there, I thought I would share a bit of Ukraine's Jewish history and see what we can make of that. So currently in Ukraine, in the capital city of Kyiv, there's approximately 100,000 Jews. Odessa in the south is nearly 45,000. It also has Jewish community centers, schools, orphanages, even a museum. Dnipro has around 60,000 Jewish residents. It also has kosher restaurants, even a mikveh. And I've been reading the same stories many of you have been about synagogues that have become shelters for the Jewish community, for members who did not get out of the country in time. Stories of rabbis who could have left, but who stayed behind to serve their community, who remained with those who could not get out, many of whom were too sick or too poor to travel. But not just the present day. I've been reading a bit more about some of the Ukrainian Jews throughout history, figures that have left a lasting impact in our world. So the first one I wanted to share was Rabbi Menachem Nachum Twersky. He's also known as the Chernobyl Rebbe. Born in 1730, he was the founder of a Hasidic dynasty that still today has many followers, the Chernobyl Hasidim. The city today is now known for the nuclear accident, but it's the city where this dynasty comes from. You might be familiar with one of his descendants, Rabbi Abraham Twersky, who passed away last year, but was a well-known rabbi and psychiatrist specializing in addiction. But his ancestor, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Twersky, the Chernobyl Rebbe, was one of the important pioneering figures of the Hasidic movement. He was a student of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, and he was also a student of the Baal Shem Tov's successor, the Maggid of Mezrich. And he later went on to found his own Hasidic dynasty, in which he taught the Torah that he learned from his teachers. And on our Parsha this week, in his commentary, he offers a drash on one of the verses. Take from yourselves an offering to God, every one of generous here. Bring the offerings to Adonai, gold, silver, and bronze. He asks a question. Why does the Torah have to specify, take from yourselves an offering? Would anyone dare think that they could bring God an offering that came from someone else, something that was stolen? Like many other Hasidic sources, he reads the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, as a metaphor. Not that God will dwell in this physical space, in the building, but that the people who build it, the people who dedicate their lives to God, that it's in them God will dwell. And so the Rebbe teaches in this Parsha that for God's presence to dwell among us, it requires more than just giving items. We have to give ourselves. We have to direct our actions towards God, towards a sacred purpose. And only then can God dwell among humanity. And he teaches that more than anything else, it's our words, our speech, that can create a place for God. He drashes on the idea that the Torah was given in the Midbar, in the wilderness. But playing on the Hebrew letters within the word wilderness, Midbar, or the Hebrew root, Dalet, Bet, and Resh, speech. He teaches that speech, more than anything, our words, can be used for a holy purpose. Just as God had the power to create the world with speech, so too we have the power to create or destroy with our own speech, with our words. The news coming out of Ukraine fills me with dread. The fate of the Jewish community, the fate of all of the citizens of Ukraine concerns me. The oppression taking place from those who speak dissent in Russia concerns me. And the question of what happens next makes me terrified. But the Chernobyl Rebbe teaches us that there is something we can do. We have a task, and it's to use our speech to create a world where God can dwell. In this case, I think it's to use our speech for hope, our words for hope. There's another story about Ukraine that I think is worth telling, and another Jewish figure who came from there. You may not be familiar with the town of Boyarka, but you might be more familiar with the village of Anatevka. And by Boyarka is the setting of Sholem Aleichem stories about Tevye the dairyman. And the name was changed to Anatevka in its stage adaptation, Fiddler on the Roof. Boyarka is located in modern-day Ukraine outside of Kyiv, and at the time the stories take place, it was part of the Russian Empire. And like many great writers, Sholem Aleichem wrote what he knew. He himself grew up in a shtetl near Kyiv. He was a prolific author, referred to by some as the Jewish Mark Twain, and his writings not only defined Jewish literature, Yiddish literature, but what it means when we talk about Jewish humor. He found things to laugh at in a world marked often by sadness and difficulty. And in doing so, he gave countless people hope. His words were powerful. They had an incredible impact on Jews in the world. I found myself this week rereading some of his stories, and one of them stood out to me. It's titled Dreyfus and Karoslevka. Describes the Jews of this town of Karoslevka deeply concerned about what was going on in Paris to Alfred Dreyfus, the French Jewish officer wrongly accused and convicted of espionage. Many at the time saw it as a sign that anti-Semitism could never be eliminated. They took the pessimistic outlook that if in even a sophisticated society, a city such as Paris, it would happen, it must just be an inevitable fact of the world. For many, it took away their hope that as Jews we could ever live in peace and prosperity in a non-Jewish world. And like Jews from all around, the people in Sholem Aleichem tale followed the news of the Dreyfus affair very, very closely. But in this town, there was only one man, Zadel, who subscribed to a newspaper. So each day when the newspaper arrived, Zadel would go to the post office, pick up his paper, he would read it, and he would go to the synagogue, and he would report there to the rest of the Jewish community. And each day the townspeople would gather closely to listen, filling the synagogue, waiting for him to come with news of the trial in Paris. The people soon were so eager that they began to gather at his house, rather than waiting for Zadel to get to the synagogue. And with time, they became so involved in the events in Paris that even waiting for Zadel to return to his home from the post office was too much. So they went and they waited outside the post office, getting there before he even arrived to pick up his paper. Finally, as the trial ends and the verdict is printed and published, Zadel opens his paper and reads the news. And this is what Sholem Aleichem describes as the scene when he announces to them that the verdict was guilty. Their outcry was not against the judges who gave the wrong verdict, not at the generals who swore falsely, not at the French who showed themselves so badly. Their outcry was against Zadel. It cannot be, Karoslevka shouted with one voice. Such a verdict is impossible. Heaven and earth swore that truth must prevail. What kind of lies are you telling us? Fools, Zadel shouted, and he thrust the paper in their faces. Look and see what the paper says. Paper, shouted the people of Karoslevka. If you stood with one foot in the heaven and the other on earth, would we believe you? Such a thing must not be. It must never be. Never, never. It's a powerful story. Even in the face of fact, even in the face of despair, of terrible news, what do the Jewish people of this town do? They don't buy it. They have hope that that cannot be the case. They will never believe that that is the world that they live in. The Jewish answer, when we see news that seems daunting, is to remain undaunted. When the world makes us frightened, the Jewish response is to be unintimidated, to hold on to hope even when things seem hopeless. Just as the townspeople of Karoslevka would not accept a world could be that unjust, that vicious, we too must have hope. We must believe that the world as it appears today is not the true world. It's not actually how the story ends. Well, it is and it isn't. Sholem Aleichem published this story before Alfred Dreyfus was exonerated. It ended right there where I stopped, with the townspeople refusing to accept the news, refusing to believe what the paper said. Such a thing must not be, it must never be. Never, never. But later it was republished, and he adds at the very end of it a question from the narrator. And who was right? Was it Zadel who had the facts, or the townspeople who had hope? We know that Dreyfus was exonerated. What Sholem Aleichem realized was that throughout most of history, Jews have had very little political power. But both he and the Chernobyl Rebbe, they recognize that we do have a power, and that power is speech. Words are our power. There's one more Ukrainian Jew that needs to be mentioned, Natan Sharansky. He spent nearly a decade in a Soviet prison for standing up and speaking out. And at his sentencing hearing, he spoke a powerful and defiant message of hope. This is how he closed to the tribunal. For more than 2,000 years, the Jewish people, my people, have been dispersed. But wherever they are, wherever Jews are found, every year they have repeated, L'shana haba'a b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. Now when I am further than ever from my people, from Avital, when I am facing so many arduous years of imprisonment, I say, turning to my people, to my Avital, next year in Jerusalem. And now I turn to you, the court, who are required to confirm a predetermined sentence today. To you I have nothing to say. Even in the face of being pushed further and further from his dreams, he had hope. He used his words to create a world in which that hope could live. Today we have more power than we ever have as a people throughout history. We can use our economic, our political, our social resources and others to support those who are oppressed, to stand with the people of Ukraine. But our greatest power, our greatest ability to change the world is to not fall into the trap of pessimism, to refuse to believe that injustice, that suffering are simply the ways of the world, but to speak words of hope. It's the lesson from the Chernobyl Rebbe, the lesson from Sholem Aleichem, and the lesson from Natan Sharansky and so many Jews who have come before us. I want to conclude today with the prayer. Ribono Shel Olam, we pray for the safety and the well-being of not only the Jewish community, but of all the citizens of Ukraine. We pray for the brave Russian citizens who have been jailed for speaking out against injustice. We pray for those who stand for freedom and democracy around the world and the leaders of our nations, that they be guided with wisdom and strength to protect those institutions. We pray that one day soon the words of the prophet Isaiah, the vision he shared, will come true. Lo yisal goy el goy cherev, velo yimoldu od milchama. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither again shall they know war anymore. Shabbat Shalom.